Chapter 6. Floating Wind. Opening up the edges. As noted in Chapter 3, while solar energy is cheap and plentiful, wind is a critical resource to decarbonise our European economy, not least because the wind blows in the dark and in winter. Many markets are at or near saturation for onshore wind, with planning challenges mounting. The abundance of untapped resources offshore, which enjoy significantly higher capacity factors and reliability year-round, are enormous. Importantly, when the time left to decarbonise is so critical, offshore wind also benefits from significantly lower social delivery and schedule risks due to social licence challenges, which can be a major constraint onshore. While onshore wind and solar are cheap, it is almost impossible to do the gigawatt-scale farms that you can build in offshore wind. For these reasons, we dedicate the next 2 chapters to offshore wind, and floating wind more particularly. This chapter provides an overview of the floating offshore wind technology destined to shape the future of wind energy, as well as providing further exploration of its unique and transformative power. The consequences of the floating wind revolution for the energy transition, particularly for regions on the periphery of Europe, are further discussed with an insightful case study in Chapter 7. Why the world categorically needs floating offshore wind. The immediate and drastic action needed to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming is alarmingly absent. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, we are on track for approximately 2.4 to 2.9 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. The carbon budget for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is almost depleted. Failing to act this decade makes it impossible to stay within safe limits. The work by scientists at the Potsdam Institute shows how close we are to exceeding safe operating spaces for humanity. Certain climate systems, such as the polar ice sheets, the Amazon rainforest, and ocean circulation, could reach tipping points where warming triggers large, irreversible change, sometimes referred to as runaway climate change. In 2021, research showed that the Amazon rainforest ecosystem had shifted from being a carbon sink to a carbon source in the last 20 years. This decade is the decisive decade for climate action. The clock is ticking on the opportunity to arrest runaway climate change. The urgency of the situation cannot be overestimated. We have the solutions, but we need to implement and scale them. Huge progress has been achieved in the past decade with renewable energy technology. Traditional wind power, heat pumps, and other fossil-free technologies have experienced a sharp drop in prices. The plummeting costs of solar and battery technology have been the most dramatic and impressive of all. However, regulation, planning, and social acceptance are pervasive issues that limit the impact the technology has made. Even if we could remove these barriers, it is not simply a matter of promoting the cheapest solution. No single renewable technology provides a silver bullet for the displacement of fossil fuels. The higher capacity factors, scalability, seasonal and geographic complementarity, and versatility of offshore wind makes it a key player in the energy mix. Geopolitical factors and market interventions also play a role in the deployment of renewable technologies around the world. Fixed bottom foundations will supply 1/4 to 1/3 of the generation needed to achieve the estimated 740 gigawatts of offshore wind required to decarbonise Europe by 2050, modelled in Chapter 8. Or at best, fixed bottom will supply less than 50% of the installed capacity required to fulfill the 496 gigawatt European governments have collectively agreed as fixed and floating offshore wind targets by 2050. The shallow waters needed for fixed bottom foundations are not distributed evenly in Europe or around the world. Many of these locations are already saturated by marine activities concentrated close to the coast, and fixed bottom projects only make commercial sense in up to 60 metres of water depth. Therefore, floating offshore wind technology, a solution for deep water, is absolutely essential to the future of wind energy and to a sustainable energy transition. This exciting technology is crucial for tapping into the vast wind resources available in deep ocean waters. Figure 20 shows the extraordinary advantages available in the northwest of Europe, where water depths and wind speeds are best suited to floating offshore wind development. 80% of the offshore wind resource globally is in water depths of 60 metres or more. Floating offshore wind is vitally important in the global transition to renewable energy and to the fight against climate change. The arrival of floating offshore wind technology is opening new opportunities on the edge of deeper waters, Figure 21. This ensures higher levels of renewables deployment and access to stronger and more consistent wind resources, resulting in higher energy production and a more reliable power supply. Limited visual impact arising from the distance of floating turbines from the shore offers an advantage to coastal communities, while potentially lowering conflicts with other marine users and ecosystems. The industry is at a nascent stage, with 270 megawatts of demonstration projects in operation at the end of 2023. Unsurprisingly, the sector is on a significant learning and growth trajectory. Projections suggest 1.5 to 4 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2030. This is a downward adjustment on the estimates by the Global Wind Energy Council, which suggested that by 2030, floating offshore wind could reach 19 gigawatts of installed capacity worldwide. The more realistic build-out forecast by Aker is based on actual project progress, challenges en route to market, and general uncertainty in the offshore wind market. On this basis, commercialization of the sector is now expected from projects to come on stream in the early to mid-2030s. By 2040, with continued technological advancements, floating offshore wind capacity could contribute hundreds of additional gigawatts to the total offshore wind capacity. Looking ahead, GWEC estimates that around 2,000 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity will be needed by 2050 to stay on a pathway aligned with the Paris Agreement. A substantial portion of this capacity will need to come from floating. Benefits of floating offshore wind to Europe. Transformative regional impacts. The benefits of floating offshore wind are undeniably transformative. This is due to the potential scale of the industry, in tandem with the role that floating wind can play in reorientating the fate of traditionally marginal geographic regions of Europe. There are two essential elements to this transformation. 1. The combination of vast quantities of firm power from floating offshore wind as a counterbalance to the intermittency of solar energy. And 2. A supergrid to transmit vast amounts of power quickly to where it is most needed. This encapsulates the big idea of this book. Scale and connectivity. A key point is that floating technology is unique in its ability to generate unprecedented quantities of power from the remote maritime periphery of Europe to meet customer demand from the centre of the continent. Serving this demand through floating wind will be a cornerstone in achieving European strategic energy autonomy and decarbonisation. Energy security. Harnessing the abundant power of floating offshore wind from the margins of Europe can be a positive adversary against the weaponisation of energy discussed later in the Markets chapter. For Europe to take command of its energy destiny, it needs to replace its dependency on fossil fuels with an abundant source of clean, green European power. This will mean breaking long and complex relationships between member states and oil majors, traditionally designed to provide profits of extraordinary magnitude to shareholders. In summer 2024, Saudi Arabia's state-owned oil company, Saudi Aramco, announced plans to pay its shareholders a record-breaking quarterly dividend of €28 billion. The only way to proceed with the messy divorce from such institutions will be to replace fossil fuels with an alternative energy supply system that can deliver consistently more competitive power. Potential for cost competitiveness. When floating offshore wind is developed at scale in Europe, it will become more affordable than oil and gas. As with its fixed-bottom predecessor, when the turbine blades start turning, they will push expensive fossil fuels off the electricity grid and help to protect both citizens and economies. Economic security. In addition to energy security vital to geopolitical stability, benefits include job creation, supply chain development, inward investment, economic diversification, and technological innovation. These factors contribute to resilient and sustainable economies. Renewable UK highlighted the long-term rewards for upfront investment in floating offshore wind. It estimated that the industry has the potential to deliver £47 billion in UK gross value add, GVA, by 2050, creating almost 97,000 jobs in the process. Just transition. The floating sector also provides an opportunity for a just transition, offering alternative employment for workers from the North Sea oil and gas industry. These socio-economic factors and other benefits are illustrated in greater detail in Chapter 7, using Ireland as a case study. Decarbonisation. The single greatest ecosystem impact of floating offshore wind will be positive, i.e., its ability to mitigate against the worst impacts of climate change on vulnerable species and habitats, including our oceans. The small island nation of Ireland, with its vast continental shelf, has the potential to deliver 30 to 80 gigawatts of floating offshore wind capacity. The environmental benefits are immense, contributing to reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. Deploying a conservative estimate of 30 gigawatts of floating offshore wind would mitigate circa 82 million tonnes of CO2 per year. To put this in context, this is roughly equivalent to annual emissions from about 20 average coal-fired power plants. It would take about 1.3 billion tree seedlings grown for 10 years to sequester the same amount of carbon. Out of sight and user conflict. Limited visual impact arising from the distance from shore is another benefit presented by floating wind. Coastal squeeze is the term used to explain the pressures placed on the marine environment from multiple competing sectors. Premium space for bottom-fixed wind projects closer to the shore is quickly becoming saturated. As floating offshore wind projects will be further from the shore, they are less likely to conflict with multiple other users. Marine conservation. Of the ecosystem impacts of floating offshore wind, it is generally accepted that fisheries exclusion and habitat enhancement, in the form of artificial reefs, have the potential to provide considerable ecosystem benefits. Evidence from marine protected areas, MPAs, from around the world shows the benefits of area closures, which impact species abundance, diversity and size. Co-locating floating offshore wind farms with MPAs to promote marine conservation offers the potential for marine space to contribute to energy needs, economic development and biodiversity objectives. Well-designed MPAs can lead to increased fish populations outside the protected areas, known as the spillover effect. This is important in the context of coexistence with fishing, which is increasingly challenged by spatial squeeze arising from the offshore wind and conservation sectors. Biodiversity. Floating substructures, including foundations, moorings, anchors, and cables, have the potential to act as artificial reefs and fish aggregating devices. Opportunities exist to incorporate nature-inclusive design, NID, into early-stage project planning. Nature-inclusive design can avail of a range of off-the-shelf technologies that seek to improve marine habitats. Eco-mats for covering cables, cod hotels and reef balls are just some of the innovations currently available to promote biodiversity. Technology overview. So, what is the difference between traditional and emerging offshore wind technologies? For the past 20 years, offshore wind has been built using solid foundations sunk into the ocean floor. These fixed-bottom foundations were used to build the Arklow Banks wind farm in 2003, and all the other offshore developments carried out by Eddie O'Connor's companies, Airtricity and Mainstream. They can be used to a water depth of up to approximately 60 metres. By 2024, the Seagreen project was Scotland's largest wind farm, boasting the world's deepest fixed-bottom offshore wind farm, with the deepest foundation installed at 58.7 metres deep. Fixed-bottom foundations are the solution for shallow seas like the Irish, North and Baltic Seas. Fixed-bottom jacket foundations may well be deployed in deeper waters in the future. However, there is a case to use floating foundations from water depths of 80 metres. This starting water depth for floating foundations is due to the large jump in jacket costs at 80 metres. At this depth, jackets become supersized and lose the advantage of being an established technology. Turbines, foundations, also referred to as the floating substructure or hull, moorings, and the power transmission system, including dynamic cables, inter-array and export cables, are all key components of floating offshore wind projects. Wind turbines. To date, floating offshore wind demonstration projects have used conventional wind turbine generators, originally designed for fixed or onshore wind turbines. A key characteristic of offshore wind turbine technology is the increasing scale of the machines. GE's Halide X, one of the most powerful turbines in the world, with up to 18 megawatts of capacity, has been superseded by Mingyang's giant 20-gigawatt offshore wind turbine. Other new turbine technologies, such as Seatwhirl's vertical axis, floating wind turbine, designed to capture wind from deeper waters, also has the potential to disrupt the current landscape. These innovations are coming fast. Integrating a floating platform with the selected wind turbine requires sophisticated interface engineering. Breakthrough Energy Ventures, the climate investment fund managed by Bill Gates, supports a self-erecting platform for floating offshore wind, Akaido technology. This novel system integrates the platform and turbine into a fully assembled unit that can be transported horizontally to enable floating offshore wind turbines to be deployed from 80% of ports in the United States, even those blocked by bridges. Leveraging existing maritime infrastructure will have an enormous impact by replacing the need for dedicated ports for floating wind. At technology readiness level, TRL 5, the Hokkaido technology is at a stage where components are being validated through prototype testing. The next step will be a full-scale demonstration project. This is an excellent example of the potential for disruptive innovation to impact on cost reduction pathways within the sector. Foundations. The types of foundations used with floating turbines are many and varied. There are currently more than 50 different substructure designs at various stages of development. However, there are 4 main categories of design. 1. Spar. 2. Barge. 3. Semi-submersible. And 4. Tension leg platforms. Figure 22. The effect of motion on the structures, driven by variable metocean conditions, impacts the entire system from nacelle to moorings. Each foundation design has a fundamental difference in how it responds to these environmental forcings. The best technical solutions for any given site need to consider the local specificity of the conditions. Floating foundations can be constructed from concrete or steel. Semi-submersibles are typically built from steel, while concrete has been used for barge and spar foundations. Concrete is much cheaper than steel. There are also environmental considerations when considering foundation materials. Producing 1 ton of steel emits approximately 10 to 13 times more CO2 than producing 1 ton of concrete. Using concrete can also mean more local content and require less maintenance in a marine environment. The foundations for floating offshore wind are enormous. For example, semi-submersible foundations can be up to 25 metres above sea level, with a floater mass of 3,000 to 5,000 tonnes, based on classical stiffened steel and 3-column semi-submersibles, and a footprint of up to 17,000 metres squared. For further perspective, a wind turbine generator with a capacity of 15 megawatts has a rotor diameter of 220 to 240 metres and a hub height of up to 160 metres above sea level. The maximum blade tip height is a minimum of 270 metres. Figure 23. To demonstrate the wind capturing power of these 15 megawatt turbines, Eddie often referenced the following example. The area of Croke Park, the biggest football pitch in Ireland, is 12,500 metres squared, 145 metres long by 88 metres wide. But the swept area of these turbines is 50,000 metres squared, or 4 times the area of Croke Park. Figure 24. A key question is, why are these integrated foundation and turbine systems so huge? Wouldn't it be easier to deploy larger numbers of smaller turbines? Not so. The power equation arising from increased wind velocity at height provides huge capacity benefits. One gargantuan turbine can do the job of many much more effectively. The scale of the conversion from fossil fuels to floating offshore wind as part of the rollout of renewables is beyond most people's current perception. We have a choice: to embrace the exciting new world of major marine infrastructure projects, or to accept the implications of business as usual. The human ingenuity associated with the sheer majesty of floating offshore installations will be hard to deny. Mooring systems are unique to floating offshore wind, as they fix the position of a foundation in a particular location. The number, type, and configuration of a mooring system, which includes the mooring lines and anchors, varies according to water depth and seabed type. Using single-point mooring solutions may offer future savings and enable a quicker installation process. However, these are an early-stage technology, while spread mooring systems remain the more commercially advanced option to date. In the UK, the Crown Estate, who own and manage land, including the seabed, for the benefit of the nation, plans to deliver 5 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2030 from the Celtic Sea, figure 25. Plans for commercial-scale projects in the Celtic Sea will see circa 260 turbines installed across 3 development areas, more than 1,000 anchors to secure the turbines to the seabed, with 300 kilometres of mooring lines and nearly 900 kilometres of cables. Power Transmission System. Inter-array and export cables are part of the electrical infrastructure required to transfer the power generated from the turbine to an offshore substation, and from there to onshore substations respectively. Direct current, DC, export cables are best suited to large 1 gigawatt floating projects and for sites greater than 80 kilometres from the shore, whereas bottom-fixed developments utilise static cables. Dynamic inter-array cables are needed for floating offshore wind projects. These are designed to incorporate features such as dynamic bend stiffeners, ballast and buoyancy modules to cope with movement generated by waves and currents throughout their life. The field of dynamic inter-array cables builds on knowledge and lessons learned from the deployment of these systems in the oil and gas industry. For the industry to mature, it must learn from other sectors, deploy solutions for more hostile environments, and reach a consensus on certain standards. For example, on sizes of turbines and selection of foundation types. Innovation and standardization are fundamental building blocks for industrialization, so their importance cannot be underestimated. What is the status of floating offshore wind? Floating offshore wind is at Technology Readiness Level, TRL, 9, whereby the actual system is proven to be fully operational and is ready for commercialization, figure 26. Pilot and small demonstration projects are currently underway, operating off the coasts of England, Scotland, Norway, Portugal, Spain, France, Korea, Japan, China, and Taiwan. Large commercial-scale, circa 1 gigawatt projects are expected to start coming on stream from 2030 in Europe, with earlier advances in China, Taiwan, and Korea. Expectations that floating offshore wind would have a significant impact on 2030 targets have dampened. The market has adjusted to the slower pace of the development of the sector than previously expected. This is partly because of global factors impacting the pace of the energy transition. Regulatory delays and macroeconomic conditions in the last 3 years have challenged business cases. Several floating offshore wind test and demonstration sites have proven to be capable of enduring extreme conditions. For example, the High Wind Floating Offshore Wind Demonstration Project, situated 25 kilometres off Peterhead in Aberdeenshire, first encountered harsh weather conditions during Storm Ophelia in October 2017, when wind speeds reached 125 kilometres per hour. These wind speeds were surpassed that December, when gusts exceeded 160 kilometres per hour during Storm Caroline. Pitch motion controllers integrated into the control systems have been designed to temporarily shut down operations and adjust the angle of the turbine blades during the most extreme weather events. The technology is also designed to mitigate against excessive motion from extreme waves, such as the 20-metre waves experienced by Wind Float Atlantic off Portugal during Storm Ciarán in 2023. Mingyang's 20-gigawatt Ocean X platform, engineered to endure wind speeds of up to 80 metres per second and waves as high as 30 metres, was put to the test upon installation in 2024, when Super Typhoon Yagi slammed into China's Hainan region with winds of 62 metres per second, making it the strongest typhoon to hit China. Now that the technology of floating foundations for offshore wind has been proven, the next step is to standardise and industrialise the most effective platforms for commercial-scale projects. Scotland has distinguished itself as a global leader in floating offshore wind by facilitating early-stage demonstration projects, i.e. High Wind and Kincardine, and enabling successful leasing rounds for floating capacity, known as INTOG and ScotWind. The Innovation and Targeted Oil and Gas, INTOG, was a leasing round designed to boost innovation in floating technology and reduce emissions from oil and gas platforms by powering them with offshore wind. Crown Estate Scotland offered exclusivity agreements to 13 projects for seabed leases for 500 megawatts of innovation projects and 5 gigawatts for targeted oil and gas projects. INTOG projects, such as the 100 megawatt Salamander project off the coast of Peterhead, will bridge the development gap between the current operational floating wind projects in Scotland and the ScotWind project pipeline, when those projects start coming on stream post-2030. The ScotWind leasing round was designed to build capacity for commercial-scale projects, with leases awarded to 14 floating wind farm developers to develop 20 gigawatts of capacity. These awards generated £750 million in revenue for Scotland, with potentially billions more to come in annual income. There are concerns that ScotWind developers are facing difficult business cases and strong competition from fixed-bottom projects. Perhaps the greatest challenge in Scotland is access to the grid, which is negatively impacting INTOG and ScotWind project schedules. However, on the plus side, supply chain benefits are already being felt. Market demand for high-voltage cables has increased in the wake of ScotWind. This led to an announcement in 2024 of a £350 million investment by Sumitomo Electric for a new Highland cable facility that will deliver 330 jobs over the next 10 years. In short, floating offshore wind technology is ready to be significantly ramped up. The challenge is to provide the enabling conditions for a nascent industry to develop and flourish. The UK, and Scotland in particular, is unquestionably an early leader in the sector. Floating offshore wind is considered to be the new British sea power. Fast-following markets currently include France, Norway, Italy, China, Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. Portugal, Spain, and Ireland have also signalled ambitions to develop the sector. By 2030, Europe as a whole can expect to have 1.5 to 4 gigawatts of floating offshore wind in operation. Investment has slowed down over the past 12 to 18 months due to concerns about regulatory delays, supply chain bottlenecks, plus increasing costs of capital and inflation. At the same time, government targets for offshore wind, including floating offshore wind, are increasing. For example, in April 2023, the leaders of 9 EU member states, including Ireland, gathered in Ostend to set offshore wind targets of 120 gigawatts by 2030 and 300 gigawatts by 2050 in the North Seas. A considerable quantity of this will be delivered from floating offshore wind. Today, the North Seas have a combined capacity of less than 30 gigawatts of bottom-fixed offshore wind installed. To put this in context, Europe can currently manufacture 7 gigawatts of offshore wind turbines a year. To meet the targets set in Ostend, Europe needs to manufacture 20 gigawatts of offshore wind turbines a year by the second half of this decade. Bottlenecks in the manufacturing of foundations, cables, and substations, and in the availability of installation, service, and other offshore wind vessels are looming. However, it is policy and supply chain over technology and investment that will determine the pace of development of the floating sector as a whole. Member states that develop policies to progress seabed leasing rounds, enable route to market, and invest in critical national infrastructure, such as ports and grid, will reap the benefits that floating offshore wind has to offer. The road to competitiveness. The offshore wind industry has experienced 2 decades of dramatic growth and value creation. This has been driven from Europe with large-scale deployment of conventional fixed-bottom technology in areas such as the North Sea, the Baltic, and the Irish Sea. The past decade has seen the cost of generation of offshore wind fall by a staggering 60%, driven by increased competition, low interest rates, and innovation. This has been a golden era for offshore wind in Europe. However, the offshore wind industry has the potential for significant and impressive levels of further growth. As is common with emerging technologies, floating offshore wind is currently more costly than conventional offshore wind technology. This is due to the small sizes of test and demonstration projects deployed to date, and the risk associated with pioneering technology. However, costs will fall as full commercial-scale 1 gigawatt projects start to come on stream post-2030. The US Department of Energy aimed to reduce the cost of floating offshore wind by more than 70% by deploying 15 gigawatts by 2035. The floating offshore wind shot, launched by the Biden administration, has an uncertain future following the outcome of the US presidential election in 2024. By 2050, DNV forecasts that the levelized cost of energy, LCOE, of floating offshore wind is due to fall by 80%, driven by economies of scale, serial manufacturing, and innovation. By 2030, the UK Floating Offshore Wind Task Force aims to achieve an LCOE of under £100 per megawatt hour for floating offshore wind. This may be a stretch target, but it indicates confidence in cost reductions being achieved. The technical and economic challenges associated with cost reduction pathways for floating offshore wind relate to system dynamics, operational efficiencies, and cost of capital. Various novel technologies are coming through in areas such as larger turbines, concrete floating platforms, shallower draft platforms, smaller platforms supporting smaller capacity turbines, autonomous vessels, and other solutions to enable maintenance and/or replacement of large components offshore. For example, uncrewed surface vessels, such as the leading technology developed by Exocean, can have a significant impact on cost reductions for offshore surveys. Figure 27. Turbine capacities are expected to become standardized at 15 megawatts this decade, with larger turbines expected in the longer term. With full-scale commercial floating offshore wind farms expected from 2030, it is likely that turbine sizes will have grown in capacity and dimensions. This is both a challenge and an opportunity for the industry. The challenge relates to the need for standardization to facilitate industrialization. The opportunity relates to the ability to capture more energy and hence achieve greater efficiencies and cost benefits. competition from Chinese turbine manufacturers is increasingly likely to disrupt markets, with aggressive pricing entering into European auctions. Renexia, the renewables arm of Italy's Toto construction group, is reported to be engaged with Mingyang to supply its 2.8 gigawatts floating offshore wind project, Medwind, off the coast of Sicily, in preparation for the pending Italian auction of 7 gigawatts of floating capacity. Mingyang are also innovating. In 2024, the company launched the world's largest single-capacity floating turbine platform, Ocean X, with two 8.3 megawatt twin turbines. Work undertaken by the UK Catapult Centre of Excellence on Floating Offshore Wind examined the role of innovation in getting to subsidy-free floating offshore wind farm scenarios. While a zero-subsidy world could currently be regarded as a moonshot for floating offshore wind farms, it is important to note that developers of fixed-bottom projects have achieved spectacular cost savings on LCOE, to a point where more than 2.5 gigawatts of zero-subsidy capacity has now been bid into the European offshore markets. For now, the Contract for Difference (CFD) mechanism provides developers with a guaranteed strike price for the first 15 years of their project's power output. This provides developers and their backers with the stability required to make a financial investment decision. Floating offshore wind is unable to compete just yet against established technologies, hence the importance of the provision of ring-fenced pots in the technology's route to commercialization. As costs come down, corporate power purchase agreements will provide another form of offtake for floating offshore wind. These will demand competitive prices. It is fair to say that floating offshore wind is at a crossroads in its evolution. Governments want to see prices go down before tendering capacity, while developers seek higher capacity projects to be auctioned to reduce prices. Cumulative installed capacity is one of the drivers of cost reduction. It is a case of chicken and egg that requires political leadership and appropriate policies necessary to stimulate a nascent industry, at the same time as sounding the death knell for fossil fuels. This can be achieved through a combination of auction terms, regulatory certainty, and investment by the state in critical enabling infrastructure, specifically ports and grid. All of these government interventions can help to de-risk projects for developers, with consequences for how much it ultimately costs to develop projects. Finally, policymakers will have noted with interest the results of the world's first commercial-scale floating offshore wind auction announced by the French government in May 2024. In theory, this marked the start of the era of floating offshore wind as a commercially viable technology. The winning CFD strike price was €86.45 per megawatt hour for a 250 megawatt project in southern Brittany with COD by 2030. Despite the successful result of the venture led by BayWa and Eliseo, few developers would expect to deliver viable commercial returns at this level, at this stage in the industry. If the French consortium can deliver the 250 megawatt project at the winning price, it will have a positive knock-on impact across the industry. This was quickly followed by the award of a CFD for a 400 megawatt project off Scotland. Flotation Energy and Vargron are the developers behind the £2.5 billion Green Vault project, which cleared the Allocation Round 6 AR6 auction at £139.93 per megawatt hour, €162.31 per megawatt hour, well below the £176 per megawatt hour €204 per megawatt hour maximum available, but arguably more realistic than the French auction price. This is now set to become the world's largest floating offshore wind farm. When completed, Greenvolt will be 580 megawatts, with additional offtake to oil and gas platforms off the Peterhead coast. Greenvolt's larger project size and ability to access different revenue streams may have allowed it to achieve its low strike price relative to the cap. Competition is central to CFDs. However, given the early-stage development of floating offshore wind, it is fair to question if this approach is suitable for driving strategic investment. The emphasis on cost competitiveness risks sidelining the well-advanced, smaller test and demonstration projects that were unable to compete against Greenvolt in AR6. Provision should now be made to support the delivery of these T&D projects, both as catalysts for supply chain development and to ensure that the learnings necessary to achieve cost reductions are actually achieved for the sector as a whole. Key enablers for floating offshore wind. While there are many solutions to be advanced, from supply chains to skills, we focus our message on 3 critical enablers required to support the emerging floating sector. These are 1. Investment in ports, 2. Investment in grid and alternative routes to market, and 3. Supportive policy and regulatory frameworks. These 3 enablers must be delivered in parallel and with the urgency that matches legally binding decarbonisation commitments. There are major challenges and opportunities associated with enabling critical port and grid infrastructure. In investment terms alone, Europe needs to double its annual grid investments and channel €9 billion into the modernisation and expansion of its port infrastructure between now and 2030. Building ports for floating offshore wind. Several strategic installation ports will provide the backbone for the floating offshore wind industry, Figure 28. This is where the turbines and the foundations are assembled, integrated, launched, and wet stored before being towed to their final hookup location, offshore. These ports must have the necessary water depths, heavy lift quays, and available land-side facilities to facilitate these processes. It is clear from the images included in this book that these floating foundations are very large. To keep costs down, they need to be manufactured at the nearest possible location to where they are going to be permanently installed. Ports have to be made ready for this to capture the full benefit of the enterprise value associated with servicing the floating sector. To be cost-effective and to manage the risk of downtime from weather on towing operations, the foundations should be manufactured as close to the project location as possible, within circa 100 kilometres. Ports will also need to provide wet storage, in other words, deep water anchorages, where integrated units can be stored whilst awaiting favourable weather conditions for deployment. With strategic investment in local ports, floating offshore wind can deliver a greater sum and share of local content than fixed bottom technology. For a hypothetical commercial-scale project off the south coast of Ireland, local content could reach up to 33% for floating wind, compared to 14% for a fixed bottom, jacket-based equivalent project. Much can be learned from the port of Esbjerg in Denmark, arguably the leading port in Europe in terms of supporting fixed-bottom offshore wind. It played a strategic role in facilitating the development of the offshore wind sector in Denmark over a decade ago by pivoting to become a specialised port. Today, the port hosts companies from across the entire offshore wind supply chain, including world-class companies specialised in handling and servicing wind installations. To secure similar benefits, the French government announced a €4.1 billion support scheme for floating wind in the Mediterranean, approved under the EU Green Deal in 2023. Large sums are being invested in its Mediterranean and Atlantic ports to enable floating wind turbine deployment in the regions. For example, Port La Nouvelle near Narbonne in southern France has dedicated facilities to build and assemble offshore floating wind turbines close to the best windy location in the western Mediterranean. The deep-water port is publicly owned by Occitanie-Pyrénées-Méditerranée, the second largest region in France, and privately managed. It is spending more than €680 million enlarging facilities, with funding secured through the regional government to ensure it does not transgress EU state aid rules. Port expansion plans will deliver 210 hectares of zoned space, of which 40 hectares will be dedicated to storing and assembling turbine parts. In tandem, the port is supporting 2 floating pilot projects. A joint venture called EFGL is building 3 10-megawatt floating turbines 16 kilometres off the coast of Leucate and Le Bas-Carré, close to the Spanish border, while Olmed is installing 3 10-megawatt turbines 15 kilometres off the nearby coastal town of Grichon. Port activities during the operational phase of a floating offshore wind farm will depend on the logistics strategy for vessel support and whether a tow-to-port or in-situ approach is taken to repairs. Ultimately, decisions taken now regarding public investment in port capacity for floating offshore wind will be a deciding factor in who gets to reap the benefits on offer from the sector. The development of local port capacity is a vital prerequisite to achieving local supply chain benefits from floating offshore wind. Ambitious policies are required to scale supply chains and to overcome global shortages expected in the coming years. For example, with installation vessels. Massive investments are needed, but these are a drop in the ocean relative to the return on investment from job creation, energy security, and all the other benefits discussed. There is a need to focus resources on those clean energy supply chains, where Europe can build a sustainable competitive advantage. It has already done this with fixed-bottom wind. While there are major supply chain challenges looming, European policymakers should proceed with the confidence that can be gained from the experience, track record, and positive impact of the sector to date. Accessing vital routes to market. Off-takers for floating offshore wind will be from the public and private sectors. CFD auction rounds represent the most established route to market in the public sphere. Regular subsidised auctions are required to bring floating offshore wind to the electricity market. Some European member states are working together to facilitate a coordinated approach to project and grid development, including joint auctions, which will open markets to greater cross-border collaboration. This provides for economies of scale and enhanced competition, but challenges with regulatory alignment and revenue sharing need to be worked out. Countries in the North Seas Energy Cooperation, NSEC, led by Germany, the Netherlands and Denmark, are exploring joint auction instruments. Auctions may offer fixed-price contracts, CFDs, or other financial incentives that stabilise revenue streams. Corporate Power Purchase Agreements, CPPAs, are likely to become an increasingly popular route to market for offshore wind projects as projects become more competitive. In CPPAs, companies directly purchase renewable energy from onshore wind or solar farms, providing developers with long-term revenue certainty without relying on government subsidies. This helps corporations meet sustainability goals and reduce carbon footprints, while driving the growth of offshore wind by creating stable demand and supporting large-scale project financing. Additional subsidies and grants are available through programs such as the Connecting Europe Facility, CEF, or the Innovation Fund. The EU Green Hydrogen Bank, launched in 2023, is an innovative model designed to accelerate renewable hydrogen production across Europe. It provides a competitive process to support the production of green hydrogen, along with related infrastructure. This indirectly enables an alternative route to market for floating offshore wind in the longer term, subject to the evolution of the commercial case for e-fuels. Connecting the supply of floating offshore wind with the demand. All of the above require policy development, financial supports, and competitive processes for their delivery. However, they are also highly dependent on infrastructural backbones to bring the electricity generated by floating offshore wind physically to the marketplace. The European Commission estimates that around €800 billion will be needed by 2030 to upgrade and expand the electricity grid across Europe. Wind Europe estimates that €200 billion will be required specifically for offshore by 2040. This includes investments in offshore substations, subsea cables, and onshore grid reinforcements to handle the influx of energy from offshore wind, including floating. This investment is likely to materialise as arguably the most influential factor in the development of the floating sector, which will ultimately be determined by the ability to reach the market on a competitive basis. Integrating floating offshore wind into the power grid presents unique opportunities and challenges. The grid must have the capacity to harness the power of floating offshore wind effectively. This requires considerable investment in countries where national grids may have experienced underinvestment in recent years. Expansion and reinforcement of grid infrastructure include upgrades to existing transmission lines and construction of new lines, which can often be met with NIMBYism in the planning system. An investment case is helped by the fact that access to stronger and more reliable wind speeds further offshore can help with grid stability and reliability. This reliability can help balance the supply and demand of electricity via the grid, whilst enhancing energy security. On the flip side, the deep water locations of floating wind farms, generally further from the shore than conventional fixed-bottom farms, require longer and more durable undersea cables, which can be costly to install and maintain. Technological innovation in dynamic cables with higher capacities and floating substations are increasingly important to address these challenges. The integration of floating offshore wind farms with energy storage systems is also needed to mitigate the intermittency of wind energy. A range of local storage solutions exist, such as battery storage, compressed air, pumped hydro, and EVs. As discussed in the opening chapters, in the future, offshore wind farms will not only transmit electricity directly to shore, but they will also serve as interconnectors between countries and transmit electricity between different wind farms. The development of these hybrid offshore wind farms is concentrated in the North Sea, including the development of energy islands poised to harness the electricity from nearby offshore wind farms to distribute to the market. The interoperability of HVDC grids forms part of the solution. DC grids will be key to enabling the transmission of large volumes of electricity generated by future floating offshore wind farms over long distances, for example, across continents, with reduced losses. This wide area transmission capacity allows the smoothing of local fluctuations of variable sources of renewables, such as that arising from large volumes of floating offshore wind and solar energy. Private wires, also known as direct wire arrangements, can facilitate non-public grid routes to markets by facilitating direct connections from floating offshore wind farms to off-takers such as data centres or other large energy users, LEUs. This can be attractive as a more robust form of energy for critical industrial operators. Cost savings arising from reduced transmission losses can also be a benefit due to the reduction in transmission distance compared to using the public grid. In theory, private wires also involve less red tape, as there are fewer regulatory stakeholders involved. Finally, in some countries, where the grid capacity may not be available to connect the supply of floating offshore wind with the demand, alternative routes to market are needed. As discussed earlier in the book, offshore wind is seen by some parties as an avenue for green hydrogen production, but the logic does not always stack up. The cost of electricity from floating offshore wind required to power electrolyzers is too high to make this commercially viable at present. However, in future cases of energy abundance, large-scale integrated energy parks focused on the manufacturing of energy-dense liquid fuels for prime markets offer an alternative route to market for some of the energy generated by floating projects. Facilitating profound shifts in policy and regulatory frameworks. Policy is arguably the cornerstone that will dictate the global positioning of countries as early leaders, fast followers, or laggards when it comes to the floating offshore wind sector. The most effective outcomes will come from countries that can provide a policy scaffold to support the complementary objectives of climate targets, energy security, and economic development. This requires a risk appetite among policymakers that accepts the evolving nature of technology, the likelihood of cost reduction pathways, and the value of upfront investment in infrastructure and support mechanisms. Most importantly, impact will be achieved in countries where policymakers pave the way for industry, not stifle it. There is no doubt that the energy transition is off track. The aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine have distracted from and derailed the capacity to plan. Resources have been consumed with dealing with one crisis after another, to the detriment of long-term capacity building. Governments need to double down on their efforts to ensure that energy policies and investments are consistently moving in the right direction, and that more is being done in the short term to pave the way for the future. Unfortunately, more ambitious targets for offshore wind are being set by the European Commission, but the gap between what is desired and what is actually achieved continues to grow. As well as reducing the predominance of fossil fuels, one of the most effective things that policymakers can do is give as much certainty to the offshore wind industry as possible. Clear plans and timelines for seabed leasing rounds, auctions, and decision-making processes are needed for developers and entrepreneurs to raise and manage vital investments. The delivery of massive offshore wind infrastructure projects is, in essence, a public-private partnership, requiring close collaboration between government, industry, and civil society. Trust is hard-won and easily lost between these parties. Each stakeholder should be open to engagement and knowledge-sharing. With climate targets slipping beyond reach, the approach to the development of floating offshore wind needs to be bold and courageous, with a focus on acting now for the benefit of future generations. Policymakers in Europe are seen as the most progressive in offshore wind, including floating. Within Europe, Scotland is the most advanced country in floating offshore wind. Outside of the UK, Norway, Italy, and France are intensifying efforts to realise projects. Spain, Portugal, and Ireland also appear to be ramping up their ambitions. Other regions of the globe are quickly becoming fast followers. In Asia, Japanese policymakers are opening the floating offshore industry there. As the fourth largest economy in the world, Japan is hugely reliant on imported fossil fuels. In 2022, fossil fuels accounted for 73% of the electricity mix, while renewables contributed 19%. Wind power only made up 1%. All of that is about to change. Japan's massive utilities, trading houses, corporations, and renewable developers are responding to government plans to harness the wind, with a target of 10 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So far, circa 3 gigawatts of sites have been awarded. The first auction for 2 floating demonstration sites were awarded in June 2024 to the consortia led by Marubeni and MOL. These will build on the 16.8 megawatts of floating capacity currently being developed offshore of Goto City. The Inflation Reduction Act stimulated the offshore sector in the United States, with provisions to make progress on the goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. This included the provision of extended tax credits. The Biden administration goal of 15 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2035 is uncertain following the outcome of the US presidential election in 2024. Despite this, competition is emerging that has the potential to displace Europe's initial lead in floating offshore wind. Given the early stage of the industry, leadership positions are fragile and can be quickly disrupted. China is rapidly expanding its floating offshore wind ambitions by aiming to complete a 1 gigawatt project in Hainan province by 2027. The Republic of Korea aims to complete a 1.3 gigawatt project by 2028. Taiwan is delivering pre-commercial floating wind demonstration projects. The ultimate winners will be those countries that can develop a smart blend of instruments to achieve climate targets, energy security, and economic development agendas. This requires brave and ambitious policymaking, a prerequisite to achieving the energy transition and ensuring a sustainable future for all. Geopolitical stability will undoubtedly play a pivotal role in the global positioning of leading countries. The entire offshore wind sector is at an inflection point. This is worth contextualizing, as it further emphasises the urgent need for policymakers to help accelerate change. Investment has slowed, and some offshore wind projects have even been cancelled in the US and the UK due to macroeconomic conditions that have put pressure on profitability. Market sentiment in the downturn has been technology agnostic. The same factors impact conventional fixed-bottom technology as emerging floating offshore wind technology. These market conditions include exposure to increases in the cost of raw materials such as steel, bottlenecks in the supply chain, the cost of capital, and inflation. Several changes are required for the industry to return to profitability and to put the energy transition back on track. In order for the world to go green, business has to stay out of the red. Developers will need to consolidate their positions in key markets and strive to achieve greater efficiencies. At the same time, regulators will be coming under increasing pressure to remove regulatory barriers, facilitate development of supply chains, and de-risk offshore wind auctions for investors. Greater interventions in the form of carbon tax and other punitive instruments will also be required to impact competition from fossil fuels. Gas prices have fallen recently to similar levels in Europe as before the Ukraine war, challenging the relative affordability of offshore wind for the electricity consumer. Market pull will be an increasingly important parameter in the offshore wind market. Regulatory frameworks, such as the EU Net Zero Industry Act, have a key role to play in keeping the sector on track to meet ambitious targets for the energy transition. A key outcome of the Convention of Parties, COP28 in Dubai, was to triple the production of renewable energy over 7 years to 2030. However, if there is any possibility of this being achieved, the regulatory delays and commercial challenges that currently beset the industry must be addressed. If policymakers demonstrate the leadership required to drive the energy transition forward, the next 12 to 18 months could see the end of the current reset period. While the road to a return to a golden era is challenging, New opportunities arising from technological innovation will pave the way for a brighter outlook. From hopeful idea to urgent necessity. We are running out of space for conventional energy technologies, and the world is at a tipping point. Floating offshore wind is no longer just a hopeful idea, it's an urgent necessity if we are to secure a sustainable future for all. This groundbreaking technology opens up extraordinary opportunities for job creation, economic growth, and the intelligent use of our vast marine spaces. The immense potential of deep water locations is nothing short of revolutionary, offering Europe a chance to lead a global energy transformation, working in harmony with solar power from the south and a visionary supergrid. The technology is here, it's been tested, proven, and now we stand on the brink of something monumental. What comes next is the critical phase of industrialization standardizing and innovating to drive down costs and scale up. But this cannot happen on its own. Policymakers hold the keys to success. They must create the conditions that will allow this fledgling industry to not just grow, but thrive. Investments in grid infrastructure and ports, coupled with regulatory certainty, are not just helpful, they are indispensable. The urgency of this moment cannot be overstated. The climate crisis is accelerating, and the time to act is now. We must reverse the dominance of fossil fuels and fully unleash the potential of renewables, wind, solar, the supergrid, and energy storage. Floating offshore wind is not a future possibility. It's a present solution, capable of driving the energy transition in the next decade if we act decisively. Chapter Key Points. 1. 80% of the offshore wind resource globally is in water depths of 60 metres or more. Floating offshore wind is the technology solution for this deep water. 2. Floating offshore wind provides immense environmental and economic benefits, which can reorientate the traditionally marginal regions of Europe. 3. Unlocking the abundance of the floating offshore wind resource is an essential part of the energy mix required for net zero 2050 targets. 4. 66 to 75% of the offshore wind generation required in Europe must be floating. 5. There are currently more than 50 different substructure designs and 4 main categories of design: spar, barge, semi-submersible, and tension leg platforms. 6. Development of innovative solutions for turbines, dynamic cables, foundations, and moorings is key to floating offshore wind development. Innovation is driving costs down. 7. Floating offshore wind is at TRL 9, whereby the actual system is proven to be fully operational and is ready for commercialization. 8. Pilot and demonstration projects are currently in the water in Scotland, England, Norway, Portugal, Spain, France, Korea, Japan, China, and Taiwan. 9. The first commercial-scale floating projects have won CFDs in France and the UK. Large commercial-scale, greater than 1 gigawatt projects are expected to come on stream from 2030. 10. Now that the technology has been proven, the next step is to standardise and industrialise the most effective foundations and turbines for commercial-scale projects. 11. Government targets for floating offshore wind are increasing, but the ability to meet them is slipping. By 2030, Europe can expect to have 1.5 to 4 gigawatts of floating offshore wind in operation. This is less than previously expected due to regulatory delays and macroeconomic factors. 12. By 2030, the UK Floating Offshore Wind Task Force aims to achieve an LCOE of under £100 per megawatt hour for floating offshore wind. Deployment is key to future cost reductions. 13. Countries that invest in ports, grid and interconnection capacity for floating offshore wind today will achieve the maximum benefits the sector has to offer. Analysis from Renewable UK suggests a 20-time return in gross value add to the UK from early stage support to the sector. 14. Policymakers will ultimately influence which countries emerge as global kingpins, early leaders, fast followers, or laggards in floating offshore wind.